here's our list. All right, so let's get this done. This is last week's page. Remember, you're going to end up with a document that is, we got 3 weeks on this, 3 pages long. 3 weeks, 3 pages. First week on fallacies, we learned the first page. Second week, we learned the second page. Third week, we learned the third page. I like to keep it nice and stupid. That way, I feel like everyone, once we have a clearer sense of the direction and it's easy to model what the map is, it's very cool. Sorry. So we had subjectivism, appeal to majority opinion, appeal to emotion, appeal to force, attacking the person instead of the argument, and these 5 varieties of faulty appeal to expertise, where issue does not require expertise, is an expert but not in the right field, is in the right field but is not an expert. I've got tools here that are always blocking me. There is no such field, or expert meets the various criteria but is not being objective, right? So those are the ones that you practice this week. All in all, this is, I believe, 10, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 plus 5. So 10 fallacies. We're moving on now to page 2 of this 3-page document. And here we have fallacies that jump to a conclusion. We have 6. False alternative, correlation does not imply causation, disregarding an exception, slippery slope, part-hole fallacy, and hasty generalization. That comes into 3 varieties: insufficient sample size, insufficient sample variety, and insufficient sample size and variety. We're going to go over all of those. I'll read what they are, and we'll go in washes. All right, let's do this. False alternative. And remember, you'll see that eventually you'll grasp what they have in common is that they jump to a conclusion. But this is just to group them. And so let's have a look at false alternative. It's providing a choice between limited options that exclude other relevant possibilities. Let's give an example of this. And again, these are, you've encountered these, and you can, I think, all understand why they're fallacious. False alternative. All right. Suppose I say this. I'm going to have some fun, but just as I'm keeping people's names in mind. So, the man is not a scientist. Therefore, the man does not care about the truth. Right. Here's a false alternative. The man is not a scientist, therefore the man does not care about truth. Why is it a false alternative? Well, because it's dividing the world into 2 groups of people, scientists and those who aren't, right? And it's inferring, let's assume, well, let me just check for fun. There's a bunch of people called Daman, but Daman, just for fun, are you a scientist? Let me know in the chat. I'm assuming you're not. There you go. Yeah, do you care about the truth? You just said no in the chat. What about the truth? You care about the truth? Yeah, of course you care about the truth. So do I, by the way. So, Daman, we have this in common. I'm also not a scientist, right? And yet I also care about the truth. So remember, what's the conclusion here? What comes after the therefore, right? So the man does not care about truth. That would be the second proposition that shows up here. The first one is that the man is not a scientist. And remember, fallacies are errors in reasoning, and they pertain to arguments. And that is, arguments are attempts to derive a conclusion from a certain premise or premises, right? So the man is not a scientist. That's true. Can we infer from this, right, that the man does not care about truth? And again, if you had to use our methods that we're familiar with, that we know and love, for modeling this, right, what would I put at the bottom? What number would I put here at the bottom? The man does not care about truth, not about the truth, just even truth in general. Why? Because, and the reason given is that the man is not a scientist. But now let's use the other tools that we know and love. Let's use our less formal method here. What is this assuming? What's the assumption A here? What's the assumption here? What's the assumption? Yeah, Maddie, yeah, scientists are the only ones who care about the truth. So if you had to name this, yeah, no worries, Indivir. So scientists, take Maddie's formulation. Not just, so Matthias writes, scientists care about the truth. We got to go for Maddie's formulation. Only scientists. You see that, Matthias? In order to get this conclusion, you need only. Are the only ones who care about truth in general, right? And this breaks down the world into two possibilities, essentially, right? And it's like saying, like, you're either a scientist or you're not, right? And if you're not, then you don't care about the truth. And the thing is, look, there are more possibilities here, right? What's another possibility that this is overlooking? What's the possibility of someone who's not a scientist but cares about the truth? And you know one because you're talking to one right now. What is my job description? What am I? I'm not a scientist. What am I? Because I'm not a scientist. I'm a philosopher. I'm a professor. Yeah. You know, like philosophers, we care about truth. Look at this whole course, right? This whole course is concerned with truth. This is not a science course, right? You know, critical thinkers care about truth, but they're not necessarily scientists. You know, you're a mom in her kitchen raising kids isn't necessarily a scientist, but she cares about truth, right? So this is setting up a false alternative, right? It's assuming that only scientists know the truth, and it's either you are one or you're not, and therefore you don't care about the truth. That's it, right? Here's another variety. I'm going to make another version of it. Probably these ones I'll do multiple washes because they're a little trickier than the ones last week. Mark is not with us, therefore he's against us. This is a false alternative. What's it assuming? What's the false alternative? What are the two choices? You have to name that in the chat. What's the false alternative? You've got two options being presented, a menu of two options. What are the two options that this is presupposing? Yeah, you're either with us or against us. That doesn't work that way. I'm sorry. There's other possibilities, right? I could be neutral. I could be undecided. It doesn't work that way. You're either with us or against us. And then you said, well, if Mark is not with us, then he is against us, right? Yeah, so this is a false alternative. I could be neutral on something. Like I could be, by the way, take a host of political issues anywhere. I'm so uninformed about so many causes that some people feel strongly about that I sit them out and I don't have a stance on them either way. I'm not for or against. I'm still looking into things. I still don't know, or, you know, there's all sorts of possibilities. It's a false dichotomy would be another way of saying it. That's right. It's a false dichotomy. Exactly. And so false alternative could also be called false dichotomy. That's right. And so anytime you encounter that, and notice the pattern is you've got a limited menu of options, and the whole argument hinges on those options being the only possible options. And of course, the moment you realize there are other overlooked options, then this is why this is fallacious, right? Sometimes it could be three options. Like in this case, it's either with you, you're either with us or against us. You could have three options, right? You could say you are either a vegan, a vegetarian, or an omnivore. I don't know if I'm making this one up on the fly. I don't know if it's going to actually work out. You are not vegan, not a vegetarian. So you are a omnivore. Omnivore means pretty much you eat everything. All right. Let me check the spelling here. You're either a vegan, a vegetarian, or an omnivore. This would be one of the premises. It assumes, this is one of the star premises, these are the three options. Vegan, vegetarian, or omnivore. You're no vegan. You're not a vegan, so this is another premise. You're also not a vegetarian. This is another one. And again, I'm not sure if this is going to work out. But so you are an omnivore, which is the conclusion. Right? What's a possibility that's not, maybe you're smarter than I'm, vegan, vegetarian, or omnivore? Pescatarian is like a vegetarian plus fish. Maddie, is that it? Yeah, but no other meat. So pescatarian is vegetarian plus fish. What's there you go. Thank you, Maddie. So that I knew there'd be like another one. The all meat diet's a little weird, but this also would have worked. So it's a false alternative. How many alternatives are being presented here? Yeah, three. And there's more than three. And so here's the idea. if there's only three possibilities being presented in the premises, and yet there are more than three, the conclusion might still be true. You might be an omnivore, by the way. That's right. You are an omnivore. The conclusion might still be true, but it certainly cannot be inferred from the premises, right? So if you take these premises and you line them up, right? You're not a vegetarian, right? This is what it would look like. So let's say it is either A, B, or C. Other premise, it is not A, it is not B. Thus, it is C. Look, logically, look at this argument. This argument, the conclusion follows if these premises are true. But is this premise in point of fact true, this first premise here? What if there's D? If D is a possibility that was overlooked, you cannot infer C from these three premises. Let me say that again slowly. If there's another overlooked possibility, in this case, call it D, E, or F, or whatever, right? The fact that it's not A, which maybe it's not A, for real, this is a true premise. And maybe it's not B. Yeah, maybe that's all perfectly true. But you cannot infer from this conclusively that it is C. You'd have to rule out, it could still be C. You'd have to rule out E or D or whatever the additional ones. And sometimes this is where the fallacy occurs, is we will sneak in, and sometimes there's a bad intent behind it, and sometimes there isn't. So you can't always burden these things with a psychological reading, right? You can't say that people mean poorly. Sometimes they're just mistakes. They didn't think about this other possibility, like just in the same manner that I didn't think about pescatarian. I could easily imagine myself inferring this way, right? Like I'm having someone over, and I think to myself, well, they're either vegan, vegetarian, or omnivore, and they told me they're not vegan or vegetarian, so they must be omnivore. I could easily have overlooked that one, right? But the idea is that everything happens here, right? If those options are correct, then you can infer by a process of elimination what's left. But if the options are not exhaustive, then that conclusion will not follow. Is that clear, everyone, for false alternative? Cool. All right, let's do another one. We're moving forward. All right. Correlation does not imply causation. It's using the fact that one event occurred before another as sufficient evidence for the conclusion that the first event caused the second. Let me give you an example. Let me share the screen again and make up an example on the fly. All right. So let's imagine, what are we looking at here? Correlation. And I'm giving this one a more descriptive name because I'd like you to remember the slogan, does not imply causation. It has a Latin name if you wanted to like the Latin name that you could use is a post hoc ergo propter hoc. I don't want you to remember Latin. I don't think it'll be anywhere useful. Maybe it'll be able to show off at dinner parties with really nerdy people what you know. But I'd much rather you remember something that grabs what's going on, right? Correlation does not imply causation. The idea is that things succeed each other in time. But it doesn't mean because they succeed each other in time that they cause one another. Let me give you an example. This is one that's fresh in my mind because we're looking at causation in my metaphysics class, right? I suppose I say, Paul drank the whole beer. His face turned red. Then he collapsed. Let's make this a whole box of beers. All right, so Paul drank the whole box of beers, or the whole bottle of, let's make it really strong, vodka. His face turned red, then he collapsed. Thus, his red face caused his collapse. Can everyone see what's wrong with that one? In your own words, what the hell is going on with this argument? There's something fishy going on here, and I don't mean pescatarian. This doesn't make much sense. Lily, I'm glad you like that one. Look, I mean, the face turning red was not the cause of the collapsing. I agree with you, Harmon, right? Look, it happened before. Do we agree? Type in yes if you agree. It happened before, undeniably. Yeah. But that's not what caused it. And so that's the idea. The correlation just tracks a temporal sequence, right? This comes before that, or this body of data. I'm making it a little broader than post hoc ergo propter hoc, or what comes before doesn't necessarily mean what caused. I'm using the slogan. The correlation is just, let's just think of it in terms of tracking time, and it's actually tracking real causal link between events. This argument commits that fallacy. The conclusion is that his red face caused his collapse, and then it's okay, cool. Why? And then the premise is that, well, he drank the bottle of vodka, his face turned red, and then he collapsed. Right? That these things occurred in a sequence, whatever. However you want to carve this first part, the conclusion does not follow from the premises, right? Because the mere fact that something came before doesn't mean that it actually caused it. Let me give you an example also. Like when you sign a peace treaty, you use a pen, right? So we agree, like if there's a peace treaty, like say the Gaza war right now, if there's ever a peace treaty, they'll have to sit down and sign something. Right. So how's this, right? Every peace treaty was signed by a pen. Thus, pens are the leading cause of peace. Right? It's true. Every time you've seen a peace treaty, there was a pen involved, right? Thus, pens are the leading cause of peace. Doesn't matter that these things came before, they're not the actual cause of the peace. The peace was caused by something else. The mere fact that something comes before, right? Let me pause for this one, and let me pause for that one. Is that clear, everyone? Maybe I'll make up a third, but let's just check in with everyone. Is that clear? How about this? I had a friend who was a swimmer, and he was very superstitious. A lot of athletes are, and he had a special swimming cap that he cared about. He told me this. He's a retired swimmer. I knew him in track and field later on. So this one's for you, Raymond. I remember your anecdote. So imagine I say, I wore my red shirt for every race I won. Thus, it will make it make it. It makes me. It's a winning. It makes me win. It makes me win. Right? I wore my red shirt for every race I won. Thus, it makes me win. And by it, we mean the red shirt. What is this? What is this argument? What fallacies are committing? Well, correlation does not imply causation. It's true. Red shirt accompanied the winning. Red shirt accompanied the winning. So if you go down, so like let's say in the first instance, you had the red shirt, and what happened? Well, there was winning. And then in the second instance, there was a red shirt, and then there was winning, and so on. And you can't infer that the red shirt is what's causing the winning. Actually, let's take away the arrow. It's just like there was a red shirt and there was winning. It wasn't being caused. They just happen to co-vary. Now, there are some worlds in which you don't really care about causation. Like if you're a market forecaster and you manage people's financial portfolios, if you realize that there's a correlation, you don't even understand the causation, you could decide to make decisions and investments based on that. So just so you know, correlations are the gateway drug to our understanding of causation. Sometimes correlations happen, we don't even know why they happen, but sometimes we investigate further and we find out that there are more than correlations, there's actually causation. But the idea is you're wearing the red shirt and the winning here, it's not the cause, right? It's not the cause. Your red shirt could be the cause of your motivation, and the motivation could be the cause of winning, but it isn't the red shirt that's making you win. Just the fact that it came before doesn't mean it's the cause. I'm going to wrap up on this one. Is that clear, everyone? If that's clear, type in clear. If you got a question, ask your question. That's we did false alternative. Correlation does not imply causation. Yeah. And again, this is a slogan I'd like you to memorize. If you do social sciences, this is one that distinguishes a good social scientist from a bad social scientist. Disregarding an exception, also things you want to, that's good for being a good scientist. This is sometimes called accident. I don't find that name very helpful, so I've switched it to something helpful. It's applying a generalization while overlooking the distinctive qualities or circumstances that make a case an exception to that generalization. My file, here we go. Let's make up another one. So which one are we looking at now? I said it's overlooking an exception. All right. This is one fallacy that you don't always, the fallacy of accident isn't always, or overlooking an exception isn't always discussed in textbooks, but I think it really does need to be discussed. Let's give an example. Suppose I say guns are dangerous. And you say my kids' playroom is filled with guns. Thus, my kids' playroom is a dangerous place. Again, I think intuitively, all of you can understand there's something wonky. What's going on here? Why is this a bogus argument? Let's assume that this is a true premise and this is a true premise. Toy guns. Lily, you got it. They're toy guns. And when we say guns are dangerous, we mean real guns. So there's an exception to be made here for toy guns. My God, right? In order to draw this to draw this conclusion from these premises, you have to overlook an exception. When we say guns kill people, there's an exception to that, namely toy guns. And I'm telling you, there's almost an exception for every bloody damn thing you can imagine. So if you have rules, just general, rules that you formed in the world, there's an exception for that. And when you overlook that exception to extract a conclusion, that's a problem. That's a problem. And you ought not to overlook these exceptions, especially because sometimes they might be relevant. Sometimes the exceptions are not relevant. So if you say guns are dangerous, and you say, I don't know, what's a place that could be actually filled with real guns? The hunting club, let's say, all right, is filled with guns. We understand that the hunting club, yeah, Walmart in the US, yeah, Walmart, Armory, yeah, whatever, right? Thus, and then here, the hunting club, right? Not that I don't think they keep, hunting guns in a hunting club, but whatever, right? Guns are dangerous. Actually, you know what? Canadian Tire has guns, which it does. They sell hunting rifles. So Canadian Tire, not is filled with guns, but has guns, right? Thus, Canadian Tire is a dangerous place, and that argument now makes a lot more sense, right? Because there's still the exception of the toy guns is still a thing, right? So the idea that toy guns are not guns, but it's not relevant now. So this is not committing this fallacy. The previous one was. Can everyone see that? If type in clear if that's clear. If you got a question, ask your question. So there, I won't dwell too much on that one. I think these are, again, some of these, it's hard to gauge how much love they require. And I would hope that all of them you can see without my motivating it too much why they are fallacies, right? And I think that's what's cool about this, because they gives name to things you already can understand and probably were already thinking, because you've been spotting fallacies your whole life, and you've also, I'm afraid to say it, you've been committing them as well. All right, let's do slippery slope now. So how many do we have done here? Let me have a look. We have 1, 2, 3. We have 6 in all, so we're halfway through. We're doing great. All right, let's do slippery slope now. Slippery slope. And this is, again, maybe something you've heard before. The expression is out there. Arguing against something by assembling a series of hand-picked consequences that lead to a repugnant outcome or conclusion, then using that repugnance as a reason to reject the starting point. Also includes hand-picked chains of consequences leading to favorable outcomes. When I say hand-picked here, I could have said cherry-picked. Look, when you're thinking about the consequences of a thing, there's lots of possible consequences. Let's say I park a car on my grass. All right, so let's say that's this event here, this one thing that happens. I park my car on my grass. There's lots of things that could be happening. Lots of possible consequences. And of those, you can always decide to cherry pick or hand pick the one that you find least favorable. So you can say it's going to kill the grass. You say your neighbors are going to complain, right? You could also say it saves space. You could also say it's going to get someone to notice your car and want to buy it from you. These are all possible consequences of that. Like, I'm sorry, there's lots of possible consequences. And you can choose one to the exception of the others. That's what I mean by handpicked. Is you say, okay, well, this one serves my purposes, and just pick that one, right? That's what I mean by handpicked. Slippery slopes are, it looked like this formally. There's more possible consequences of this one thing, and then you're going to pick one of the others in this regard. And then there's more consequences, and you're going to pick one that suits you and disregard the others. And then what you're going to do is you're going to build a chain of consequences. If this, then that. If this, then that. If this, then that. And what you're going to end up with when you get to the end is something that sucks. Usually something that sucks. Sometimes leading to favorable outcomes, but most of the time something that sucks, something that everyone would agree, right, is bad. And the idea is you're going to say, look, the reason that you ought to reject this initial starting point is because it leads to this outcome that sucks. Let me give you an example. Let me share screen. A slippery slope. You've seen this elsewhere. All right, so here's an example of a slippery slope. Slippery slope. You don't need to make these up. If cannabis is legalized, this is one I actually remember, but you see them all the time. If cannabis is legalized, then more people will smoke. If cannabis is legalized, then more people will smoke pot. All right, fair enough. And if more people will smoke pot, then more kids will smoke pot. And if more kids smoke pot, then help me out. We're making stuff up here. Horrible scenario. More kids smoke pot, then what? We're going to construct this one together. I'm going to outsource this. You can see where I'm going with this. More kids will fail school. Harder drugs. Yeah, okay. Then more kids will, I'll pick that. Okay, cool. Thank you for helping me. Then they will try harder drugs. If they try harder drugs, then crime goes up. When crime goes up, people die. You don't want people to die. Thus, do not legalize cannabis. And notice when we get to the end, right, we reach a point near the end where it's like really, really unpalatable. And I'm pointing that out here by saying, people, you don't want people to die. I'm making explicit something that's implicit, right? People die. I don't need to make that explicit. I think we can all understand that that's a bad thing. And the idea is you're supposed to, that's a great question, Alicia, I'll get to in a second. You're supposed to recoil from that and then go right back to legalizing cannabis. Do not legalize cannabis. Now, Alicia asked a great question. Could this also be appeal to emotion? Here's the thing. There's an emotional component in here. Namely that this is the emotional component that's going to prompt your recoil from this. But it needn't be necessarily emotional, just something that you recoil from that you don't think is palatable. And importantly here is the string of if-thens. This is, Alicia, this is what makes this a slippery slope, right? It's look what we had to do to get there. So we had a starting point, which is the legalization of cannabis, which, by the way, is a done deal. It's already done in our country, right? So the starting point was kind of this less controversial starting point, and then we extract from it. We got to something much more emotional. I don't think people get too emotional about this, but they definitely get emotional about that. So there's the emotion there, Alicia. But notice all the if-thens that had to be slippery, that had to be strung together to get there. You see that, Alicia? It's the if-thens that had to be strung to get the emotion to move, make this a slippery slope. There's always emotion. Yeah. Cool. And it's the string of if-thens, right? Yeah. And it's not just hyperbole, because hyperbole is something else, right? You could, by the way, this could have been a true slippery slope, by the way. So you want to track these things. It's not just exaggeration, right? It's that the problem is that at every step you're cherry picking or hand picking one of the possible consequences when there could be several. And you're picking the one that suits your almost narrative purpose because you want to string together a story that's going to end up, you know where it's going to end. You want the story to end badly. So we backtrack to chapter 1 and say, okay, let's not go there. It's mainly there, Maddie and everybody else, it's in the hand picking of all of these consequences. And look, there's lots. And the thing is, at each step, you can imagine one of those, all right, maybe, but there's lots of other things that could have happened. And the person is clearly just cherry picking some possible future, right, to get this starting initial position to be rejected. Can everyone see that? It's the hand picking all of the consequences, like the diagram I did a moment ago. I mean, I'm going to have some fun with this. So just to show you how this could go, if cannabis is legalized, all right, then more people, all right, so if cannabis is legalized, then more people will smoke pot. Just want to give you, again, I mentioned here in, I say, and notice here the diagram, this also includes hand-picked chains of consequences leading to favorable outcomes. And the problem consists in, first of all, when you stretch yourself with too many if-then into the future, into a long chain of consequences, you're on shaky ground to begin with, right? If-then, it suffices that one of those if-thens be incorrect, that you can't get to your destination. So when you string together 3 or 4 or more if-thens, already it's kind of shady, especially if at each step you're choosing of the many consequences, some as opposed to others, and you never mention the others, right? Kind of like the false alternatives, never mention the ones that you've overlooked. And I've mentioned here that sometimes it's for favorable outcomes. We rarely talk about fallacies leading to favorable, slippery slopes leading to favorable outcomes. But I'm going to continue with this one and give you a version of it. Imagine I say if cannabis is legalized, then more people will smoke pot. If more people smoke pot, then more minds will be opened to new experiences. And this is literally a slippery slope you could have heard from the pro-legalization camp, right? If more minds get expanded, then tolerance will increase. And if tolerance increases, peace or crime will reduce, or there's a greater chance for world peace. There will be a greater chance for world peace. Thus, notice it's the opposite conclusion. And so as opposed to above, do not legalize cannabis, legalize cannabis. This is kind of like the kumbaya argument for legalizing cannabis. Thus, legalize cannabis. And notice here, it's the same, right? The format is that this is, first of all, it's stretching itself quite a lot with a lot of if-thens, right? And consequences of a consequence of a consequence. And every time you do that, you're on very tenuous ground every time you add a further consequence. But it gets to a result that's nice, right? World peace. Earlier, the sort of the result that we were supposed to recoil from is that people die. Here, this is a result that you're supposed to embrace. And then the idea is then you're supposed to put in the conclusion, which is, the starting block is the one you want to get in on. This one was, the starting position is one you want to avoid. You don't want to legalize cannabis. But notice it's also a slippery slope. It's also cherry picking, hand picking consequences of the many possible consequences. Look, when people do smoke more pot, consequences is that, it stands to reason that more kids will smoke pot. I mean, there's pot around. If you have pot in your household where there wasn't before and you have kids, that's a possibility that they might see it or whatever, right? And it's also a consequence that it does open your mind to new experiences. Anyone who's ever smoked cannabis will tell you it's, wow, I didn't know that was possible. It's like, yeah, then it does. These things they're all real possibilities, right? But one side is picking a certain set of possibilities to motivate a certain conclusion, and the other side is cherry picking another set of possibilities. And they're both fallacious. So these are both fallacies. Can everyone see that? Type in clear if that's clear. Question if you have a question. And again, you don't often see slippery slopes discussed in this manner. Like, just be aware. They also include things where you're asked to endorse the starting position, not reject the starting position, right? So just be mindful of that when you're doing your homework. All right, let me just clear all this up. Dang, a lot of little drawings here. Notice that compared to last week, they're a little harder to wrap your mind around. Am I right? Would you agree these are a little trickier than last week? I'm building them up in level of... last week was just silly. Clearly, threatening someone. Yeah, they're a little trickier, yeah. That's why this is where you could, like, I can imagine, like, remember, was it Alicia talked about, this is so that can appeal to emotion. If there's a multiple choice, right, you have all of your fallacies listed underneath, and you have the slippery slope that we saw earlier. If you don't get the right answer, which would be slippery slope, most people are going to, those who don't get the answer correctly, probably going to click on appeal to emotion. And this is where the skill is going to come in. This is why it's a university level skill, because you're going to have other fallacies that are in the vicinity, but you need to really understand what makes that fallacy distinctive in order to parse out whether it's going to be an appeal to emotion or a slippery slope. If you just go every time there's some sort of emotion, you say, oh, it's appeal to emotions. Like, no, it's a slippery slope. There are structural features to the argument that make it distinctively a slippery slope. So just be warned, everyone, this is going to get trickier. All right. Part whole fallacy. Inferring that a whole has a property merely because its parts have that property, or inferring that a part has a property merely because the whole has that property. Again, this goes by different names: fallacy of division and composition. We could conceivably track them as two different fallacies, right? This first one here, inferring that a whole has a property because the part has it, or inferring that the part has a property because the other one has it. I'm just going to clump them all together and call this a part-whole fallacy. I think that's all you need. And again, the labels are, I think, much better than fancier sounding labels like division and composition, or other things you might know about. And again, all of these have received Latin names. All right. Part-whole fallacy. Part-whole fallacy. My car has leather seats. Thus, my car is made of leather. Leather seats are a part of a whole, not the whole. This could be true. My car has leather seats. That's the premise. The conclusion is my car is made of leather. No. Why? Well, not because we're checking against the solution sheets, which is the car in the driveway, but because you can't infer it from this premise. Certainly, if you did that, you'd be confusing the part and the whole. You'd be taking the part, a property of the part, which is that it is made of leather, and saying that that's true of the whole. So the car is the whole, right? The seats is the part, and you'd be saying of the whole that it is made of leather. I think you can all see that that's completely wonky, and now you have a name for that and say, hey, you're committing a part-whole fallacy here. Can you see that, everyone? If that's clear, type in clear. Like one minority committed a crime, therefore everyone. No, here's okay. So it's a good question. So Lily asks, like, one minority committed a crime, therefore everyone in this group is a criminal. Here's the thing, though. A population of individuals isn't a whole. So remember, this is where I was going to go to. So that's a great segue because I really need to stress this. Part-whole fallacies have to include genuine wholes, not collections, right? So here it's really important to know that a whole, let me see if I have the not equal sign here. Insert a little symbol. Yes, a whole is not a collection, right? So a car is a whole. Right? A group of people is a collection. This fallacy only pertains to wholes. I'm going to underline it and put it in green, right? It does not, and this is going to be important because we're going to look at something called hasty generalization. It does not pertain to collections. I'm just going to cross that, right? This only pertains to genuine wholes. Let me give you another example. Suppose I say, my nail cannot think, which it's, by the way, it cannot think. This is a true premise. Thus, my body, or I cannot think. Or my body, or let's say I cannot think. My body cannot think. That's totally wrong, right? And we're using bodies here because that's a genuine whole. We're using cars because that's a genuine whole. They're not collections, right? And so when you're talking about populations of people, you're talking about collections, not whole. Like all of Canada put together, we're still just a collection. We're not a whole. Lydia, does that make some sense? We're going to have other means of assessing certain fallacies related to that. Yeah. Here's the thing. If you look at the argument carefully and what's involved is not a whole, there's no whole in the WHOLE sense of the term, it can't be the part whole fallacy. So here's one of the things you cannot do. You can't do this. So we'll have a different fallacy for this in a moment. Suppose you say people in Toronto are jerks. Thus, Canadians who lived in Toronto are jerks. This cannot be a part whole fallacy. Well, you might think, wait a second. Toronto is a part of Canada, but we'll have a separate fallacy for that. This would be a hasty generalization because this is not a whole, right? This would not work, so I'm going to cross it. This would, however, work. You can say this would be a problem if you said something like, I don't know, there are lots of palm trees in Florida. Thus, there are lots of palm trees in the U.S. I mean, now you're talking about Florida. It's an attribute of this is really just a part of a whole, right? Florida and the U.S. in a way that you're not. Well, this could also be. Hold on here. There are lots of palm trees in Florida. This would also be. I'm going to cross it out. This still would be a hasty generalization. This is where this is going to get tricky, right? This is where you're going to have that 1,000-level university skill. So this would still not apply. It really has to figure with a whole, right? Yeah. Does everyone see that? Type in clear if that's clear. Like I'm writing them out precisely because I want to I rule them out. That's not. It has to involve a whole. Let me give you let's do a better example. The fish section. This is gonna work. The fish section of the superstore is cold. Thus, the superstore is cold. That works. Right. The fish section of the superstore is cold, thus the superstore is cold. Here I'm not generalizing from a sample. I'm using a part-whole relation. The fish section of the superstore, which no one goes to, by the way, at least not my superstore, is a part of the whole, right? This would be legit. These would fall under the rubric of another fallacy. Is that clear, everyone? Is that one clear? Lily and everybody else type in clear if that's clear. Again, I'm coming up with some on the fly. So that would be good. And also, here I'm going from the part to the whole. So notice here, I've been going, all of these three are going from the part to the whole, right? So my car has leather seats. We're using the seats as the part, and we're inferring something about the car. That's the whole. My nail, that's a part. We talk about the whole body. That's the whole. The fish section, that's the part, and we get to the whole. It also goes in the opposite direction. Let's go back to let's use these as the examples. My car is fast. Thus, this is going to be a funny one. My cup holder is fast. Right? Car's cup holder. There you go. And this now goes from a premise that involves the whole to the part now, the cup holder. Right? And so you can go both ways. That's what I'm not asking you to track if it goes from one to the other. We're not going to assign different words for it. I think that's enough. Yeah. Oh, there you go, Lily. That's terrific. Let's do that. Let's type that one in, right? My body can think. Thus, my nail can think, right? That's not working out one bit, right? That's a great one, Lily. Beautiful. You're getting it. Yeah, so it can go from the part to the whole, or it can go from the whole to the part. Now, I want to be clear about this. There are some cases where this could be the case, right? But you need to say more to reach the conclusion, right? So it could be, for instance, that there are certain things. By the way, I don't know much. I don't know if this is urban legend. You know, holograms, they're really cool. Like like when you move around, you can kind of see them in 3D. I once heard, I don't know if this is true. Don't look it up. Don't waste your time online over this. I once heard that if you fracture a hologram with a hammer, whatever was the original picture shows up in every part of the hologram. I don't know if that's cool, but I find that's a really cool idea. I don't know if that's true. Let's say I have a portrait of myself as a hologram, and it's an 8.5 by 11, and then I slam it, and it's like a glass, and it breaks, and then each little part will have my face totally in it. There's things you could conceivably say about that would apply. They'd look like part-whole fallacies, but they'd be perfectly legit. So maybe sometimes you do find yourself in a situation where the conclusions happen to be true. The question is, can you justify the conclusion on the basis of the premise? And the idea is, if you're moving really rapidly between part and whole, assuming that because the property of the part has a certain property, the whole must, or vice versa, then that's a fallacy. I think that's pretty clear for that one. My friends, is that clear? Type in clear if that's clear. Question if you have a question. And I'm glad we got to cover some ground with that one. They really have to involve wholes. They can go both ways, and so on. Good. All right, we've come now then to the last part. So let's zoom out here. What have we done? We've got false alternative. Correlation does not imply causation. Disregarding an exception. Slippery slope. Part-whole fallacy. And then finally, hasty generalization. That's the one that we just mentioned a moment ago in passing. Let's zoom in. Let's have a look at that last one. Inferring a general proposition from an inadequate sample size, an inadequate sample. And what we mean by inadequate, it could be inadequate for the following reasons: insufficient sample size, insufficient sample variety, or insufficient sample size and variety. Let me give you some examples. The easiest way to think about hasty generalization is to think in terms of poles. This is, I feel like, your gateway drug into hasty generalization is to think in terms of like poles, poll taking. So imagine I say I poll one person in each province, and yeah, if you've done some social science, a lot of this is good. It's just good scientific methodology, or just good, but this is definitely going to be, if you've done a quantitative method, this starts to factor in, because you can have a statistical component to this particular fallacy. I polled one person in each province. They all said they despise the current prime minister. Thus, Canadians despise the current prime minister. All right, so here's the thing, right? There's a sample, the expressions here. So we know that the previous fallacy involved wholes. Wholes have to be the sort of thing that are more than just a collection. Like, the difference between a pork when it's alive and a pork when it's been butchered is that one is a collection of parts, and the other is a collection of limbs at the grocery store to be eaten. When it's a whole, it's together. There's something more to the sum. That's a super interesting philosophical question, by the way. What distinguishes a whole from a collection? You want to do metaphysics with me, we could do that in another class. But the idea is, we're going to have different terminology than wholes here. What we want to say is there has to be a population, a sample, and the idea is you're attributing to the sample, which is a subset of a population. We mean this in the broadest sense. It obviously applies to polling, because you poll a population. When we say population, that's just a generic term when it comes to what we call statistical reasoning or inductive reasoning, right? The population is the sum, the totality of that of which you're going to speak, and the sample is a subset. I wouldn't say a part, because we really want to use those terms in technical senses. It's a subset of your population. And then what you're going to do is you're going to study that sample, or that subset of your population, and you're going to find that it has a certain attribute. Like in this case, for instance, the sample is one person from each province. And so there's 10 provinces, so that would be 10 people. So that's your sample. And you found out something about those 10 people, about that sample. You found out that they say they despise the current prime minister. But then you're going to move from that premise. So the premise would be this, right? The premise would be sample is X, therefore, and then the conclusion would be population is X. This is the generic form of this form of reasoning. Now, there's nothing wrong with it. The reason why, Maddie, and some of you learn it in social sciences, is because it's indispensable. We often, we do not have a handle on populations. They're often objects of study that are far larger than anything we can actually study. So what we can study is a subset of a population, right? And so what we do is we learn about that sample, and generally, and this is not a super secure inference. It's what we call inductive reasoning. It's not deductive reasoning. So it only affords a probable levels of assurance that the conclusion holds given the premises. And there's mathematical tools for assessing how secure you can be in your trust of the conclusion given the premises. But the idea is just generally, right? If you're going to move from sample is X to population is X, you better be damn sure that your sample is large and varied. So I'll say that again. If you're going to move from this premise that says sample is X, whatever X is, right, to the conclusion that population is X, you need to make sure that your sample is large and varied. Here, we have a hasty generalization where the sample is varied, right? Varied, but has insufficient size. Right? If you think about it, there's 10 provinces. There's also 3 territories, but there's 10 provinces in each province. We can say here, and territory. So let's make it even more dramatic. And territory. And they all said that they despise the current prime minister. So the sample here would have been, 13 people, right, from each one of those provinces and territories. I don't know how many Canadians are there. What's the latest numbers? Anyone know in millions? Something like 32 million, I would imagine. I haven't checked. 40 million. We're there. Wow. Let's just put it that. There you go. And those numbers are fine with me, right? So 40 million. If you got 13 people and you're going to draw a conclusion about 40 million people, this is insufficient. Your sample is insufficient. Now, it's varied, right? So, but it has insufficient size. What's good about it is that you bothered to do a sample. You took a sample in each province, right? So, but if it's insufficient size, so that's why. And by the way, again, the question is the conclusion true or false? Well, that's not the point. The point is, can we infer the conclusion from the premises provided in the arguments? Let me say that again. The conclusion is unimportant. What we're concerned with in this course is, can we actually, and what makes this fallacious is, can you justify that conclusion on the basis of the premises given in the argument? And the answer is certainly not, right? The conclusion could still be true, but you certainly cannot sort of justify that and let that truth rest on the premises that are given, because that is insufficient in size, although to its credit has some variability, the variation. Is that clear, everyone? This is one version of it. Is that clear? So insufficient size, so varied but insufficient size. If that's clear, type in clear. If you've got a question, ask your question. And what you have essentially in this class is you'll have a starter kit for good statistical work, right? Just a starter kit. These things can get, if you're in the business of doing a lot of this kind of inference, you want to make sure those tools are far more developed. But as far as we're concerned, we just need to track when their blunders are happening. All right, let's do a hasty generalization, where I'm going to say good size, sufficient size, let's say sufficient size, but insufficient variety. Does anyone know when they're polling stuff, there's an election, we're going to have an election, we'll always have an election at some point. What's a good number of people that are polled? When you hear in the news, there was an Ipsos Reid poll or some Nanos poll, how many people are they polling generally? It's expensive to poll a lot of people. I think when I see this in the news, you should always track that a little bit, because I suppose it would make a difference. Last one, 10K. All right, that's a pretty good number. Let's agree that 10K is a good amount, right? So we want sufficient size here, right? So I'm going to make a variation on this one now, where I want to say that it's sufficient size but insufficient. So notice here, we want to be careful with our words. Sufficient size, right, but insufficient variety. So that's what I want to do. All right. So let's imagine I polled, and if let's agree to 10K people. Let's make it even more dramatic. 50K people. That would be an expensive poll. 50K people in Quebec, and they say that they despise the current prime minister. Thus, Canadians despise the current prime minister. Or if you want, you can have fun. You can put Alberta. But pick one province. I've polled 50K people in Quebec, and they said they despise the current prime minister. Thus, Canadians despise the current prime minister. Again, you see here, the size is definitely fine. This is a big size. That's 5 times, what would be a standard poll. So that's terrific. But the problem is, if the conclusion is going to range over Canadians, that's a great premise for supporting a different conclusion, right? Given this premise, so this is the premise, right? I polled 50K people in Quebec, and they say they despise the current prime minister. Thus, what would be a conclusion that this could actually support without making a fallacy? So all hinges on what's the premises and what's the conclusion. What would be a conclusion here that would make this actually a perfectly fine argument? Yeah, people in Quebec despise the current prime minister. So suppose that's your conclusion. So 2, right? People in Quebec, right, despise the current prime minister. That's a perfectly fine. That's not a hasty generalization. So if this was the conclusion, right, people in Quebec, right, despise prime minister, this would not be a fallacy. You wouldn't want to charge this with a fallacy. And again, if this was a more demanding class, I could decide to throw those in, and then you'd have some perfectly reasonable arguments, and then some unreasonable ones, some fallacious ones, and then you have to sort out which is which. And I don't want you to do that. I want to keep it simple. But as things stand, the original one I had written was Canadians despise the current prime minister. And here the problem isn't the size, it's the variety. Is that clear? We have sufficient variety. This is the one we did. Sufficient variety, but insufficient size. Sufficient size, but insufficient variety. Let's do one more. This is when you do both, right? Hasty generalization with insufficient size and insufficient variety. So that's not good. That's the worst you can make. Again, same conclusion. Well, you can see here, this is a dramatic example. You're using the sample. The population is Canadians. The sample is one person. That's what we call anecdotal evidence. It's a sample of one. That's horrendous, right? And so this is a case of insufficient size and insufficient variety. Those are the 3 possibilities that I want you to be able to track. That means when it's all said and done today, you don't have 6 arguments that I want you to learn. Let me just erase all of this. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. 8. There you go. So you have 8 new fallacies to add to the mix.